You're already 32 and still single. Must be tough, spending New Year's alone. Amanda sneered across the dining table, her voice cutting through the cheerful conversation like a blade through silk. The words hung in the air of my parents' crowded dining room, where 23 family members had gathered to celebrate the approaching midnight hour. Every fork stopped moving. Every conversation died. I felt the weight of their stares pressing against my shoulders as Amanda's satisfied smirk spread across her face. She'd timed it perfectly, waiting until everyone could hear her public execution of my personal life. I didn't flinch. Instead, I set my champagne glass down with deliberate calm, looked straight at her across the table laden with my mother's finest china, and said in a voice steady as granite, "You don't have to worry about me, Amanda. I've been married for a long time." My mom froze mid-toast, her glass still raised halfway to her lips, her mouth forming a perfect circle of shock. The silence that followed my declaration felt like standing in the eye of a hurricane. 23 pairs of eyes swiveled between Amanda and me, searching our faces for clues about what had just happened. Amanda's triumphant expression cracked like ice under sudden heat, replaced by confusion and something that looked dangerously close to panic. Dad cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. "Clifton, what do you mean you've been married?" His voice carried the careful tone he used when defusing tense situations at his accounting firm. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my wedding ring, sliding it onto my finger where it belonged. The simple platinum band caught the light from Mom's crystal chandelier, sending tiny rainbows across the white tablecloth. "I married Sarah 8 months ago in Portland. We had a small ceremony at the courthouse. Aunt Patricia, Dad's sister, who never missed an opportunity to share gossip, leaned forward so far she nearly knocked over her wine glass. But Clifton, honey, we never heard anything about a girlfriend, let alone a wife. That's because we chose to keep our relationship private." I explained, watching Amanda's face cycle through emotions like a slot machine. Sarah was completing her pediatric trauma certification program, and we didn't want the additional pressure of family expectations during such an intensive time. My cousin Derek, Amanda's usual ally in family politics, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "So you just got married without telling anyone?" "We told the people who needed to know," I said simply. Sarah's parents flew in from Michigan for the ceremony. We had a small reception afterward with a few close friends. Amanda finally found her voice, though it came out higher and more strained than her usual commanding tone. "This is ridiculous. You can't just suddenly claim you're married when you've never even mentioned dating anyone seriously." "I never claimed anything," I replied evenly. "You made an assumption about my personal life and I corrected it. Uncle Frank, the family patriarch, who everyone respected despite his gruff exterior, set down his bourbon with a decisive clink. "Well, where is she then, this mysterious wife of yours?" I glanced toward the staircase leading to the second floor, where my parents' guest rooms were located. "Actually, she's upstairs. She arrived about an hour ago, but wanted to let me handle the family introductions first." The collective gasp that followed this revelation would have been comical if the situation weren't so tense. Mom's champagne glass finally completed its journey to the table with a trembling hand. "She's here right now," Mom whispered, her voice barely audible above the grandfather clock ticking in the corner. I nodded and called toward the staircase. "Sarah, would you come down, please?" The sound of heels clicking against hardwood floors echoed from above, growing closer with each step. Every person in that dining room held their breath as a figure appeared at the top of the stairs. Sarah descended with the grace of someone completely comfortable in her own skin, wearing a midnight blue dress that complemented her auburn hair perfectly. Her warm smile encompassed the entire room as she reached the bottom step, and I felt a surge of pride watching my family's jaws drop collectively. "Hello, everyone." Sarah said, her voice carrying the gentle confidence that had first attracted me to her. I'm so sorry for the dramatic entrance. I'm Sarah Morrison, and I'm absolutely delighted to finally meet Clifton's family. The transformation in the dining room was immediate and electric. Sarah moved through the space like a skilled diplomat, extending her hand to each family member with genuine warmth that seemed to melt their confusion into fascination. Aunt Patricia practically swooned when Sarah complimented her vintage brooch, and Uncle Frank's perpetual scowl softened when she asked about his recent knee surgery. I've heard so much about all of you. Sarah continued accepting Dad's offer of a chair next to mine. Clifton talks about your family constantly. He's especially proud of the camping trips you used to take to Yellowstone Frank. Uncle Frank's weathered face actually cracked a smile. That boy always did love those mountains. Had the best fishing instincts of any kid I ever taught. I watched Amanda's expression darken as the attention in the room shifted completely away from her calculated humiliation and toward genuine curiosity about Sarah. For 29 years, Amanda had been the center of every family gathering the golden child, who everyone fussed over and praised. Now she sat frozen in her chair, watching a stranger effortlessly command the respect she'd spent decades cultivating. Kyle, Amanda's husband, looked mortified by his wife's earlier performance. He caught my eye and mouthed an apology before turning to Sarah with obvious relief. It's wonderful to meet you, Sarah. I have to ask, what do you do for work? I'm a pediatric trauma nurse at Portland General Hospital, Sarah replied, settling into her chair with natural elegance. I specialize in critical care for children who've experienced severe injuries. Cousin Jennifer, who'd been studying to become a teacher, leaned forward with genuine interest. That must be incredibly challenging work. How do you handle the emotional weight of it? As Sarah launched into a thoughtful explanation about pediatric trauma care, I noticed Amanda's growing agitation. Her fingers drummed against the tablecloth, and her smile became increasingly forced as family members hung on Sarah's every word. I think it's wonderful that you found each other. Mom finally managed, though her voice still carried traces of shock. But I have to ask, why keep it secret? We're family. We would have been supportive. Amanda seized the opening like a predator spotting wounded prey. That's exactly what I'm wondering, she interjected, her voice dripping with false concern. I mean, it does seem odd, doesn't it? Most people want to share happy news with their families, unless there's something they're trying to hide. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Sarah's composed expression never wavered, but I felt my protective instincts flare to life. There's nothing to hide, I said firmly, placing my hand over Sarah's on the table. We made a practical decision based on our circumstances. Sarah was working 18-hour shifts during her certification program, and I was traveling constantly for consulting projects. We didn't want the added pressure of planning a big wedding or dealing with family expectations during such a demanding time. But surely you could have mentioned you were dating someone seriously. Amanda pressed her voice, taking on the wheedling tone she'd used to manipulate situations since childhood. I mean, we tell each other everything in this family, don't we? Sarah turned toward Amanda with the kind of patient smile she probably used with difficult patients' parents. I understand your confusion, Amanda. From what Clifton's told me, you two have always been very close. But every relationship develops at its own pace, and we chose to take things slowly and privately. Kohorm. Close. Amanda's laugh carried a sharp edge. I suppose that's one way to put it, though I have to wonder what kind of marriage starts with such secrecy. It makes a person think you're just playing house rather than having a real commitment. The insult hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. I started to respond, but before I could speak, a small voice piped up from the living room doorway. Mommy, I fell down and my knee hurts. Amanda's 3-year-old son, Tommy, announced, tears streaming down his chubby cheeks as he held up a scraped knee that was bleeding slightly. Amanda started to rise, but Tommy's eyes had already locked onto Sarah. Without hesitation, he toddled straight past his mother and climbed onto Sarah's lap, burying his face against her shoulder. "Oh, sweetie, let me take a look at that," Sarah murmured gently, examining the scrape with practiced hands. "You're going to be just fine. It's not too deep, but we should clean it up so it heals properly." She looked around the table and spotted Mom's cloth napkin. "Mrs. Morrison, may I borrow this? And perhaps someone could bring me some warm water and a small bandage." Mom jumped up immediately, clearly grateful for something to do. Of course. Robert, go get the first aid kit from the bathroom." As Sarah tended to Tommy's injury with gentle efficiency, explaining each step in a soothing voice that kept the little boy calm, I watched Amanda's face cycle through a spectrum of emotions. Her own child had chosen a stranger's comfort over hers, and the rejection was written plainly across her features. "There we go, brave boy," Sarah said, securing a small bandage decorated with cartoon dinosaurs over the cleaned scrape. "You're all better now. But next time you're running around, try to watch out for those sneaky floor edges, okay?" Tommy giggled and nodded, then surprised everyone by planting a kiss on Sarah's cheek before sliding off her lap to show his father the bandage. The silence that followed was different from before. Where there had been tension and confusion now, there was something approaching awe. Sarah had just demonstrated more maternal instinct and medical competence in 5 minutes than most people managed in years. Uncle Frank broke the quiet with a low chuckle. "Well, I'll be damned. Looks like Clifton found himself a keeper." As the evening progressed and conversations resumed around the table, I found myself studying the family dynamics with new eyes. Sarah's presence had shifted something fundamental in the room's atmosphere, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. But for me, that light illuminated patterns I'd been blind to for decades. Watching Amanda struggle to regain her position as the family's center of attention brought back a flood of memories I'd buried deep. When we were 7 and 8, she'd convinced my best friend Marcus that I'd said terrible things about his mother, effectively ending our friendship. When I made the honor roll in high school, Amanda mysteriously forgot to tell our parents about the ceremony, and they missed seeing me receive my award. When I graduated college with highest honors, Amanda scheduled her gender reveal party for the same weekend, ensuring all family attention focused on her pregnancy announcement. The pattern was so consistent, so deliberate, that I wondered how I'd never seen it clearly before. Clifton always was the smart one, Aunt Patricia was saying to Sarah, pulling me back to the present conversation. Got that engineering scholarship to Colorado State, started his own business right out of college. Actually, Amanda interjected quickly, Clifton's had a hard time finding stable work. That's why he travels so much. He has to take whatever contracts he can find. The casual dismissal of my success hit me like a physical blow. Sarah's hand found mine under the table, her thumb stroking across my knuckles in silent support. "I think there might be some confusion there," Sarah said gently but firmly. "Clifton owns one of the most successful software consulting firms in the Pacific Northwest. His clients include 3 Fortune 500 companies, and he travels by choice because he enjoys the variety of projects." Amanda's cheeks flushed red, but before she could respond, Uncle Frank leaned forward with interest. "Is that right, Clifton? You never mentioned having your own company?" "It never came up," I said, simply, though I remembered multiple occasions when I'd tried to share professional achievements, only to have Amanda redirect conversations toward her own accomplishments or problems. Dad looked genuinely surprised. "How long have you been running your own business?" 7 years, I replied, watching Amanda's expression grow more pinched with each word. "I started freelancing after graduation and gradually built a client base. Now I have 6 full-time employees and offices in Portland and Denver." 6 employees. Mom's voice carried a note of wonder that stung more than Amanda's earlier cruelty. How had my own parents known so little about my life? Kyle cleared his throat uncomfortably. "That's really impressive, Clifton. Amanda and I have been talking about starting our own business, but the financial risk seems overwhelming. It takes time to build." I acknowledged, noting how Kyle's comment made Amanda's jaw tighten further. But the freedom is worth the initial uncertainty. Freedom, Amanda repeated with a bitter laugh. Must be nice to have that luxury. Some of us have responsibilities, families to support, mortgages to pay. The implication was clear. Amanda wanted everyone to believe that I lived some carefree bachelor existence, while she shouldered real adult obligations. It was a narrative she'd been crafting for years, and watching it crumble in real time was clearly devastating for her. Sarah's medical training had obviously included dealing with difficult people, because her response was masterfully diplomatic. Actually, Clifton's been incredibly responsible about planning for our future together. He's already started setting aside money for our children's education funds, even though we're just beginning to talk about starting a family. The phrase children's education funds dropped into the conversation like a depth charge. Amanda had always prided herself on being the practical, forward-thinking sibling, the one who planned responsibly for the future. Learning that I was not only married, but already planning for hypothetical children clearly shattered another pillar of her self-image. Uncle Frank raised his bourbon glass in a toast. Well, here's to forward thinking and finding the right person to share life with. As the family raised their glasses, I caught Amanda's expression in the candlelight. For just a moment, the mask of superiority slipped, completely revealing something raw and desperate underneath. It occurred to me that Amanda's need to diminish my accomplishments might stem from her own deep insecurities about the choices she'd made. She'd married Kyle immediately after college, more to avoid being alone than out of genuine love. They'd rushed into buying a house they couldn't really afford, had children, before they were financially stable, and spent years living paycheck to paycheck while maintaining the appearance of suburban success. Meanwhile, I'd taken time to build a career, discover what I actually wanted from life. I'd found Sarah not through desperation or social pressure, but through genuine connection and shared values. The contrast must have been painful for Amanda to acknowledge. As if summoned by my thoughts, Kyle leaned over to whisper something in Amanda's ear. Her response was a sharp shake of her head and a hissed comment I couldn't quite catch. But Kyle's face flushed with embarrassment, and he spent the rest of the course avoiding eye contact with anyone at the table. The evening was revealing fractures in my family that went far deeper than sibling rivalry. These were foundational cracks that had been forming for years, hidden beneath the surface of polite gatherings and carefully maintained appearances. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one left standing in the rubble. The next morning brought an unusual quiet to my parents' house. Most of the extended family had returned to their own homes, leaving just the core group for the traditional New Year's Day brunch. I woke early and found Sarah in the kitchen, helping Mom prepare pancakes and bacon with the easy familiarity of someone who belonged. "Your mother was just telling me about your high school science fair project," Sarah said, smiling as she flipped a pancake with perfect technique. "Building a working robot sounds incredibly ambitious for a 16-year-old. Mom beamed with obvious pride. "He won first place at the state competition. We were so proud, though I have to admit we didn't understand half of what he'd created." It was a memory I'd forgotten, buried under years of Amanda's subtle diminishment of my achievements. But seeing Mom's genuine enthusiasm now made me realize how much of my family's appreciation had been filtered through Amanda's interpretations over the years. Amanda arrived for brunch 45 minutes late, her usual power play to ensure everyone was waiting for her. But instead of the typical family accommodation of her schedule, conversations continued without pause. Uncle Frank was deep in discussion with Sarah about pediatric emergency protocols, while Dad peppered me with questions about software development that he'd never shown interest in before. "Sorry we're late," Amanda announced, though her tone suggested she wasn't sorry at all. "Tommy had a complete meltdown about leaving his new toys at home." Kyle trailed behind her carrying their diaper bag and looking harassed. "He just really wanted to bring that robot Clifton gave him yesterday," he explained apologetically. I'd bought Tommy a small programmable robot from a toy store near my hotel, thinking he might enjoy the lights and sounds. It was a simple gesture, but Tommy had been fascinated with it all evening. It was very thoughtful. Kyle continued shooting a meaningful look at his wife. Tommy hasn't put it down since last night. Amanda's smile looked like it had been painted on with house paint. Yes, it was unexpected, though I do worry about screen time and electronic toys for children so young. Actually, Sarah interjected gently, educational robotics can be wonderful for developing spatial reasoning and problem-solving skills in young children. The key is interactive engagement rather than passive consumption. It was a perfectly reasonable comment backed by Sarah's professional experience with child development. But I watched Amanda's face darken as she realized her subtle criticism had been countered by someone with actual expertise. The brunch proceeded with Amanda growing increasingly agitated as she found herself marginalized in conversations she'd typically dominated. When Dad asked about my recent project implementing security systems for a major hospital network, Amanda interrupted 3 times to redirect attention to Tommy's potty training progress. After the meal, Amanda cornered me in the garage while I was helping Dad organize his workshop. "We need to talk," she said, her voice carrying the commanding tone she'd used since childhood. "What about?" "About this whole situation with Sarah. Don't you think it's moving a little fast? I mean, you barely know her." I set down the wrench I'd been organizing and turned to face her fully. "Amanda, I've been with Sarah for over a year. We lived together for 6 months before getting married. I know her better than I've ever known anyone." "That's exactly what I'm worried about." She pressed, stepping closer with the intensity she brought to all her manipulation attempts. "You're so desperate to prove you're not a failure that you're rushing into something that could destroy your life." The words hit like slaps, each one designed to find the vulnerabilities she'd been cataloging since we were children. But instead of the familiar sting of her emotional attacks, I felt something different. Clarity. "Is that really what you think of me?" I asked quietly. "That I'm so pathetic I'd marry someone just to avoid being alone?" Amanda's expression flickered with uncertainty. She wasn't used to me responding with questions instead of defensive denials. "I think you're making a mistake," she said, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. "And as your sister, it's my job to protect you from poor decisions." "Like you protected me when you told Mom and Dad I was skipping school senior year when I was actually staying after for tutoring. Or when you convinced Cousin Rachel that I had a crush on her boyfriend, ruining my friendship with her entire friend group." The color drained from Amanda's face. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Or like when you scheduled your baby shower for the same day as my college graduation ceremony, forcing our parents to choose between events." "That wasn't intentional," she whispered, but her eyes couldn't meet mine. 25 years, Amanda. 25 years of you systematically undermining every relationship achievement and opportunity I've had. And now that I've found real happiness despite your interference, you want to destroy that too." She recoiled as if I'd struck her. "That's not... I never meant..." "What did you mean? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've spent our entire lives ensuring I'd never outshine you in our parents' eyes." Amanda's composure cracked completely. "You don't understand," she said, tears starting to flow. "You were always the smart one, the talented one. Everyone expected great things from you. I had to work twice as hard just to get noticed." The admission hung between us like a bridge neither of us knew how to cross. "So you decided to tear me down instead of building yourself up?" "I was just a kid." She sobbed. "I didn't know what I was doing. And then it became a habit. A way to feel better about myself." "Oh, and Sarah, what's your excuse for attacking my wife?" Amanda's tears stopped as quickly as they'd started, replaced by something cold and calculating. "I'm not attacking anyone. I'm just asking questions that someone needs to ask. Like why a successful nurse would marry someone she barely knows in a secret ceremony." The shift back to manipulation was so sudden, it gave me whiplash. "Because we love each other. and wanted to start our marriage privately. Or because she needed a green card, Amanda said quietly, as if the thought had just occurred to her. I mean, you said she's from Michigan originally, but people lie about things like that. Have you seen her birth certificate? Her passport? The suggestion was so absurd, so desperately grasping that I almost laughed. Amanda Sarah was born in Grand Rapids. Her parents are second-generation German Americans who own a bakery downtown. But I could see the wheels turning in Amanda's head, searching for any angle that might validate her suspicions. She was like a conspiracy theorist presented with evidence that contradicted her beliefs. Instead of accepting reality, she'd simply construct more elaborate theories to maintain her worldview. I'm going back inside, I said, realizing that continuing this conversation would only feed her desperation. Sarah and I are leaving in an hour to catch our flight back to Portland. You're running away, Amanda called after me. Just like you always do when things get complicated. I paused at the garage door and turned back to look at my sister. For the first time in my life, I saw her clearly, not as the powerful figure who dominated my childhood, but as a deeply insecure woman whose entire identity depended on maintaining superiority over others. I'm not running away, I said calmly. I'm going home to my wife and the life we've built together. You should try building something positive instead of spending all your energy tearing other people down. The last thing I saw before closing the door was Amanda's face twisted with rage and something that looked disturbingly like hatred. 3 weeks later, I received a phone call that would change everything. Mom's voice was tight with stress when she called on a Tuesday evening while Sarah and I were cooking dinner together. Clifton, we need to talk as a family. Can you and Sarah come to Denver this weekend? I've asked Amanda and Kyle to be here too. The formal tone was so unlike Mom's usual warm chatter that I immediately knew something serious had happened. Is everything okay? Is Dad all right? Your father is fine, honey. But there are some things that need to be addressed, and I think it's better to do it in person. Sarah looked up from the vegetables she was chopping, her expression concerned as she read my face. I put the call on speaker so she could hear. Mom, what kind of things you're making me nervous? There was a long pause before Mom spoke again, her voice heavy with exhaustion. Amanda has been calling other family members with some very disturbing allegations about Sarah. Uncle Frank called me yesterday to ask if it was true that Sarah was an illegal immigrant who tricked you into marriage. My stomach dropped like a stone. She what? Aunt Patricia received a similar call along with some story about Sarah having a secret boyfriend in Portland. Amanda even contacted my book club to ask if anyone knew about immigration fraud and how to report it. Sarah's knife stilled against the cutting board. Her face had gone pale, but her expression remained steady. Years of dealing with medical emergencies had taught her to stay calm under pressure. Mom, those allegations are completely false and potentially illegal. Amanda could be charged with defamation for spreading lies like that. I know, sweetheart. That's why we need to have this conversation as a family. Your father and I have been talking, and we realize we've enabled some very unhealthy behavior for far too long. When we arrived in Denver on Saturday morning, the atmosphere in my parents' house felt like the moments before a thunderstorm. Uncle Frank was already there, his jaw set in the grim expression he'd worn during his military service. Aunt Patricia sat rigidly in Mom's favorite armchair, clutching her purse like a shield. Amanda and Kyle arrived 20 minutes late, which had once been fashionably dramatic, but now felt petty and disrespectful. Amanda swept into the living room, as if she were hosting the gathering, but the usual deference from other family members was conspicuously absent. I think everyone knows why we're here, Mom began without preamble. Amanda, the phone calls you've been making to family members need to stop immediately. Amanda's carefully constructed expression of innocence would have been convincing to someone who hadn't spent 32 years studying her manipulations. I don't know what you mean. I was just sharing some concerns about Clifton's welfare with people who care about him. Welfare concerns. Uncle Frank's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to cutting through nonsense. You told my wife that Sarah was probably an illegal immigrant who seduced Clifton for citizenship. You suggested that their marriage was fake, and that we should consider calling immigration authorities. The accusations hung in the air like acid smoke. I felt Sarah's hand find mine, her grip steady, despite the personal attack. I never said anything definitive, Amanda protested. I just pointed out that the whole situation seemed suspicious. I mean, they got married in secret, she appeared out of nowhere, and Clifton has never been successful with women before. Stop right there! Dad interjected, his accountant's precision cutting through Amanda's deflections. We've spoken with several family members about the calls you made. Aunt Patricia, would you please share what Amanda told you specifically? Aunt Patricia shifted uncomfortably, but spoke with clear determination. She said that Clifton had been tricked into marriage by a woman who was probably using him for immigration status. She asked me to watch for signs that Sarah was planning to leave him once she got her papers sorted out. And Frank, what did she tell Susan? Uncle Frank's weathered face was hard as granite. That Sarah was likely involved with another man in Portland, and that the marriage was a sham to cover up her real relationship. She suggested that someone should investigate Sarah's background to protect Clifton from being humiliated. The systematic nature of Amanda's campaign was breathtaking in its maliciousness. She hadn't simply spread rumors. She'd crafted a coordinated attack designed to isolate Sarah and undermine our marriage. Kyle looked physically sick as the extent of his wife's behavior became clear. Amanda, you told me you were just concerned about Clifton's happiness. You never mentioned making these kinds of accusations to other people. I was protecting him, Amanda insisted, but her voice had taken on a shrill quality that betrayed her growing desperation. Someone had to ask the difficult questions, since he was obviously too infatuated to see clearly. Protecting him from what? Sarah spoke for the first time since we'd arrived, her voice calm, but carrying an edge I'd never heard before. From marrying someone who loves him, from finding happiness with a partner who supports his goals. Amanda turned to face Sarah directly, and I saw something ugly and primitive in her expression. From making the biggest mistake of his life with someone who's clearly not what she pretends to be. And what exactly do you think I'm pretending to be? I think you saw a lonely man with money and took advantage of his desperation. The insult was so blatant, so cruel, that the entire room recoiled. But Sarah's composure never cracked. I see, she said quietly. So, in your mind, the only reason a woman would marry Clifton is for financial gain, not because he's brilliant, funny kind, and one of the most genuinely good men I've ever met. Amanda's face flushed red, but she pressed on with her attack. I think you calculated that a successful software consultant with family money would be a good target for someone looking to improve their circumstances. Family money. I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity. Amanda, our parents are retired on a teacher's pension, and Dad's small accounting practice. What family money are you talking about? The question seemed to break something in Amanda's carefully constructed narrative. She opened and closed her mouth several times before managing to respond. I know you've been successful recently, but… Recently, Dad interrupted. Clifton, didn't you say you've owned your business for 7 years? That's correct. I've been completely financially independent since I was 25. Mom looked genuinely confused. But Amanda, you've always told us that Clifton was struggling to find steady work. That's why we stopped asking about his career. The room fell silent as the implications of Mom's statement sank in. For years, Amanda had been filtering information between me and our parents, ensuring they had a distorted view of my actual circumstances. I never said he was struggling, Amanda protested weakly. I just mentioned that consulting work can be unpredictable. No, Dad said firmly, his accountant's memory for details serving him well. You specifically told us last Christmas that Clifton had to take whatever work he could find because he couldn't get hired permanently anywhere. You said we shouldn't pressure him about his career because he was already sensitive about his failures. The systematic deception was staggering. Amanda hadn't just undermined my relationships with family members. She'd actively managed their perceptions of my life to maintain her position as the successful child. Kyle stood up abruptly, his face pale with shock and embarrassment. "I need some air," he announced, walking quickly toward the back door. Amanda watched her husband leave with growing panic in her eyes. "Kyle doesn't understand the whole situation," she said desperately. "He doesn't know how manipulative Clifton can be when he wants something." Uncle Frank's patience finally snapped completely. "Manipulative? The boy hasn't said a cross word about you in 30 years, despite everything you've put him through. If anyone's been manipulative here, it sure as hell isn't Clifton. Everything I've put him through." Amanda's voice reached a pitch that would have shattered glass. "I've been trying to help him his entire life. I've covered for his social awkwardness, made excuses for his failures, tried to boost his confidence when everyone could see he was hopeless with relationships. By sabotaging every friendship he tried to make," Mom asked quietly. "By scheduling your important events on the same days as his achievements, by ensuring that we never knew about his actual successes." Amanda looked around the room like a cornered animal searching for any ally who might validate her version of reality. But every face reflected the same expression of disappointment and dawning understanding. "You don't understand," she whispered, tears starting to flow again. "I was just trying to protect the family from embarrassment. Clifton was always so naive, so trusting. People took advantage of him." "The only person who took advantage of Clifton was you," Uncle Frank said with finality. "And now you're trying to destroy his marriage because you can't stand to see him happy?" Amanda's composure shattered completely. "Fine," she screamed, her voice echoing off the walls. "Yes, I was trying to protect him from making another stupid mistake. Yes, I thought she was using him. And yes, I still think there's something not right about their whole relationship. Someone had to be realistic about the situation." The admission hung in the air like a confession at trial. Amanda had just acknowledged everything we'd suspected about her motivations and methods. But instead of the satisfaction I'd expected to feel at finally hearing the truth, I felt something closer to sadness. This was my sister, the person who should have been my closest ally in life, admitting that she'd spent decades systematically undermining my happiness. Kyle returned from the backyard at that moment, his face grim with resolve. "Amanda, we need to leave. Now." "Kyle, you don't understand what's happening here. They're all turning against me." "No," Kyle said firmly. "I understand perfectly. And we're going home so we can have a very long conversation about the kind of person I married." As Kyle gathered their children's belongings with barely controlled anger, Amanda made one final desperate attempt to regain control. "This isn't over," she said, looking directly at Sarah. "I know there's something you're hiding, and I'm going to find out what it is." The threat was so absurd, so detached from reality, that Sarah actually smiled. "Amanda, I hope you do investigate my background. You'll find that I graduated magna cum laude from University of Michigan's nursing program, completed my trauma certification at Johns Hopkins, published research on pediatric emergency protocols, and won a national award for excellence in patient care last year. I hope learning about my actual accomplishments brings you some peace." As Amanda and Kyle left with their children, the house felt like it was finally able to breathe again. But the damage she'd done to family relationships would take time to repair. The aftermath of that weekend confrontation rippled through our family like an earthquake, revealing fault lines that had been hidden for decades. Within a week, I received calls from relatives I hadn't spoken to in years, each sharing stories about Amanda's manipulations that painted a pattern far more extensive than I'd realized. Cousin Jennifer called to apologize for years of distance, explaining that Amanda had told her I'd criticized her choice to become a teacher instead of pursuing something more challenging. Cousin Derek admitted that Amanda had convinced him I was jealous of his military service, causing a rift that had lasted through his entire deployment overseas. Most painfully, Aunt Patricia revealed that Amanda had been telling extended family for years that I was resentful of their success and preferred not to be included in family celebrations. Dozens of invitations, I'd never received gatherings. I'd thought I wasn't welcome at relationships that had withered from neglect that wasn't actually neglect at all. I feel so terrible, Aunt Patricia said during our phone conversation, her voice thick with regret. We just believed her because she was family, and she seemed to know you better than anyone. But the most significant consequence was Kyle's decision to temporarily separate from Amanda. 3 days after the confrontation, he called me directly. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest, he said without preamble. How long has Amanda been lying about you to your family? Probably since we were children, I admitted, though I only realized the scope of it recently. Kyle was quiet for a long moment. She's been lying to me about a lot of things too. Our finances, her spending habits, conversations she's had with my parents. I'm starting to wonder what else I don't know about my own life. He'd moved into his parents' basement with their children while he and Amanda attended emergency marriage counseling. The sudden loss of her primary support system had forced Amanda into a kind of reckoning she'd never experienced before. I don't want our kids to grow up thinking it's normal to tear people down to build yourself up, Kyle continued. If Amanda can't change fundamentally, I can't stay married to her. The ultimatum appeared to be working. Mom reported that Amanda had started individual therapy in addition to the couple's counseling, and she'd stopped her campaign of calls to family members. But the damage to her relationships would take years to repair, if it was possible at all. Meanwhile, Sarah and I found ourselves suddenly included in family plans we'd been excluded from for years. Uncle Frank invited us to his annual fishing trip, explaining that he'd always thought I wasn't interested, because Amanda had told him I considered fishing a waste of time. Mom started calling weekly to share news and ask about our lives, admitting that she'd avoided reaching out before, because Amanda had convinced her that I found their check-ins intrusive and stressful. I feel like I'm getting to know my son for the first time in years, she said during one of our conversations. I had no idea how much of our relationship was being filtered through Amanda's interpretations. The most surprising development came from Uncle Frank, who called me one evening with an unexpected proposition. Clifton, I've been thinking about our conversation at New Year's, and I want to make you an offer. I'm getting too old to maintain the cabin in Colorado, but I don't want to sell it to strangers. Would you and Sarah be interested in taking it over? The mountain cabin had been in our family for 40 years, a rustic retreat where Frank had taught 3 generations of kids to fish hike and appreciate the wilderness. Amanda had always assumed she'd inherit it, given her position as the favored grandchild. Uncle Frank, that's incredibly generous, but are you sure? I know Amanda's always loved that place. Frank's laugh carried no humor. After what I witnessed at New Year's, I wouldn't trust Amanda with a houseplant, let alone a property that means something to me. Besides, I've watched how you and Sarah interact. You appreciate what's really important. The offer represented more than just real estate. It was Frank's way of acknowledging that family legacy should go to people who would honor it, not those who simply expected it. Sarah fell in love with the cabin immediately when we drove up to see it the following weekend. The 2-bedroom log structure sat on 5 acres of pine forest, with a view of snow-capped peaks that took your breath away. Frank had built most of the furniture by hand, and every room carried memories of family gatherings that had shaped decades of relationships. I can see us bringing our children here someday, Sarah said, standing on the wraparound porch as sunset painted the mountains gold and purple. Teaching them to appreciate nature, family traditions, the simple things that really matter. As we watched the stars emerge in the clear mountain air, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed in just a few months. I'd gained not just a wife, but a clearer understanding of family dynamics that had confused me for years. More importantly, I'd learned to recognize the difference between people who loved me for who I was and those who needed me to be less than I could be. Amanda's attempts to destroy my marriage had backfired completely. Instead of isolating Sarah, Her attacks had exposed her own character to family members who'd been blind to her manipulations for decades. Instead of preserving her position as the favored child, her behavior had cost her the respect she'd spent her life cultivating. But perhaps most significantly, her crisis had forced Kyle to confront the reality of their marriage. For the first time in their relationship, he was demanding honesty and accountability from someone who'd never been required to provide either. The consequences of that weekend were still unfolding, but one thing was clear: the family dynamics that had shaped our relationships for decades were finally changing. 6 months after that pivotal New Year's Eve, Sarah and I stood together on the deck of Uncle Frank's mountain cabin, watching the sun set behind peaks that seemed to touch the sky itself. But this wasn't just another weekend getaway. Today we were hosting our proper wedding reception, surrounded by family members who genuinely knew and loved us both. The transformation in our family relationships had been profound and healing. Mom and Dad had become regular visitors to Portland, staying in our guest room, and marveling at the life Sarah and I had built together. They'd met Sarah's parents during a joint vacation to the Oregon coast, and the four of them had formed a friendship based on shared values rather than social obligation. Uncle Frank had officially transferred the cabin deed to our names the previous month, along with a letter expressing his confidence that we'd preserve its legacy for future generations. "Some people inherit property," he'd written. "Others inherit responsibility. You two understand the difference." But perhaps the most remarkable change involved Amanda herself. Losing Kyle's respect and facing the potential destruction of her marriage had forced Amanda into the kind of self-examination she'd avoided her entire life. The individual therapy she'd begun in desperation had gradually revealed the deep insecurity and childhood trauma that had driven her need to control and diminish others. "I spent so many years competing with you that I forgot how to be happy for anyone else's success," she'd told me during one of our cautious reconciliation conversations. "I was so afraid of being overlooked that I made sure everyone else felt invisible." The apology, when it finally came, was genuine and comprehensive. Amanda acknowledged specific instances of sabotage dating back to elementary school, taking responsibility for years of manipulation without making excuses or deflecting blame. More importantly, she'd apologized directly to Sarah, admitting that her attacks had been driven by jealousy rather than legitimate concern. Kyle had returned home after 4 months of separation, but only after Amanda demonstrated consistent progress in therapy and made concrete changes to her behavior patterns. They were rebuilding their marriage on a foundation of honesty that had never existed before, and their children were benefiting from parents who were learning to communicate without manipulation. As I watched Amanda help her daughter pick wildflowers near the cabin's garden, I marveled at how different she seemed. The desperate edge that had driven her competitive behavior had softened into something approaching peace. She was learning to find satisfaction in her own accomplishments rather than in diminishing others. "She looks happier," Sarah observed, following my gaze toward my sister. "More relaxed than I've ever seen her." "Therapy's been good for her," I agreed. "Though I think losing everything she thought she wanted forced her to figure out what actually matters." The wedding reception itself was everything our courthouse ceremony hadn't been. 50 family members and friends gathered to celebrate not just our marriage, but the healing of relationships that had been damaged for years. Sarah's parents had flown in from Michigan, her colleagues from the hospital had driven up from Portland, and my business partners had closed their offices early to attend. But the most meaningful moment came when Uncle Frank stood to offer a toast as the evening light faded into starlight. "I've lived long enough to see families torn apart by pride, jealousy, and the inability to admit mistakes," he said, his weathered voice carrying across the assembled group. "But I've also learned that the strongest families aren't those that avoid conflict. They're the ones that face truth honestly and choose love over ego when it matters most." He raised his glass toward Sarah and me. To Clifton and Sarah, who showed us that real success isn't about proving you're better than someone else. It's about building a life so authentic and fulfilling that other people's opinions become irrelevant. As the celebration continued around us, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought us to this moment. Amanda's cruel attack at that New Year's dinner had been intended to humiliate me, to reinforce the family narrative that painted me as the unsuccessful sibling who couldn't find love or build a meaningful life. Instead, her cruelty had exposed the lies that had shaped our family dynamics for decades. It had forced conversations that were long overdue and revealed truths that had been hidden by years of careful manipulation. Most importantly, it had demonstrated that the greatest revenge against those who try to diminish us isn't retaliation or anger. It's living so fully and authentically that their attempts to tear us down only highlight their own emptiness. Sarah and I had built our relationship on honesty, mutual respect, and shared goals. We'd taken time to know each other deeply before making permanent commitments, and we'd chosen to start our marriage privately, because that felt right for us, not because we had something to hide. Amanda's assumptions about our relationship revealed more about her own insecurities than about our actual circumstances. Her need to believe that Sarah was using me financially stemmed from her own approach to relationships as transactions rather than genuine connections. But perhaps the most important lesson from our experience was about family itself. Blood relationships don't automatically create love, respect, or loyalty. Those qualities must be earned and maintained through consistent behavior over time. A family member who undermines your happiness isn't protecting you from anything except your own potential. At the same time, people can change if they're willing to do the difficult work of honest self-examination. Amanda's transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it had required losing nearly everything she valued before she was willing to confront the destructive patterns she'd developed. As the evening wound down and guests began to say their goodbyes, Kyle approached me with a serious expression. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "I knew Amanda could be difficult, but I didn't realize how systematically she'd been undermining your relationships. I should have spoken up years ago." "You didn't know the full extent of it," I replied. "None of us did until recently." Kyle nodded thoughtfully. "Can I ask you something? How did you manage to build such a successful life despite everything she did to sabotage you?" The question required genuine consideration. How had I managed to create a thriving business, maintain my self-worth, and eventually find love despite years of systematic undermining from someone who should have been my greatest supporter? I think the key was learning to validate myself instead of seeking validation from others. I said finally, "Amanda could control what our family knew about my life, but she couldn't control my actual experiences or achievements. I had to learn to measure success by my own standards rather than by family recognition. And you never gave up on finding someone who would appreciate who you really are." I glanced over at Sarah, who was helping Mom pack leftover food with the easy competence that characterized everything she did. I think the secret was becoming someone worth appreciating first. I focused on building the life I wanted to live, and Sarah was attracted to that authenticity rather than to some performance designed to impress people. As Kyle rejoined Amanda and their children for the drive back to Denver, I felt a profound sense of completion. The family wounds that had festered for decades were finally healing, not because we'd ignored the problems, but because we'd faced them honestly and demanded better from ourselves and each other. Sarah and I spent our final hour on the cabin deck, wrapped in blankets, and watching the Milky Way emerge in the clear mountain sky. The silence between us was comfortable, filled with shared contentment rather than the need for constant conversation. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Amanda hadn't made that comment at New Year's?" Sarah asked eventually. I considered the question seriously. I think we would have told the family about our marriage eventually, but probably not for several more months. And Amanda's pattern of manipulation might have continued for years before anyone recognized it. So in a strange way, her cruelty actually helped everyone. Sometimes the worst moments in our lives force the most important conversations, I reflected. Amanda's attack was cruel and intended to hurt us, but it also created an opportunity for truth that might not have existed otherwise. Sarah curled closer to me, her warmth anchoring me to the present moment. I'm grateful it happened the way it did. Not because I enjoyed being attacked, but because it showed me how your family could change when they knew the real story. As we prepared to head back inside, I thought about the viewers who would eventually hear this story. People who might be dealing with their own family manipulations, their own struggles to maintain self-worth in the face of others' cruelty, their own journeys toward authentic relationships built on genuine love rather than social expectation. The lesson I'd learned wasn't about revenge or proving people wrong. It was about the power of living authentically despite others' attempts to diminish us. When we build lives based on our own values rather than others' approval, we become impossible to truly destroy. The people who love us will recognize our worth, and the people who don't will eventually expose themselves through their own behavior. Sometimes the cruelest attacks come from those closest to us, driven by their own fears and insecurities rather than our actual failings. The greatest victory isn't proving them wrong, but building a life so genuine and fulfilling that their opinions become irrelevant. Family relationships can be healed, but only when toxic patterns are confronted with truth and accountability. And sometimes the most painful moments in our lives create space for the most beautiful transformations. As Sarah and I turned off the cabin lights and prepared for sleep, I realized that Amanda's cruel question at that New Year's dinner had been answered more completely than she could have imagined. Yes, I was 32. Yes, I had been single for most of my adult life. But I hadn't been spending New Year's alone because I was a failure. I'd been building the foundation for a love story that was worth waiting for. Have you ever had someone in your family try to tear you down when you were finding happiness? How did you handle their negativity while protecting your own joy? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Sometimes sharing these experiences helps us all feel less alone in dealing with difficult family dynamics. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about overcoming family challenges and building authentic relationships. And if you know someone who's dealing with family manipulation or struggling to maintain their self-worth, despite others' cruelty, please share this story with them. Sometimes knowing we're not alone in these experiences makes all the difference. Thank you for listening to my story, and I hope it reminds you that your worth isn't determined by others' opinions of you. Keep building the authentic life you deserve, and the right people will recognize and celebrate your value.